You're listening to the Wrestling Changed My Life podcast, episode 94 with Mark Branch.
Yeah, I put out a tweet like last week. I said, I don't know when, but I said, I think, wrestling will become the sport of all sports.
We can endure anything and adapt and pivot and change. Wrestling gave us that ability.
I would say nothing in life has impacted me more than the things wrestling has taught me in terms of self-reflection, resilience.
Toughness. Some guys have it, some guys don't.
Adversity, 100%. How to pick myself up and be a man after I failed.
And everything that has shaped my life and where I'm at today would not be there without the values and basically the lessons I've learned through the sport of wrestling.
For me, wrestling saved my life because it allowed me to focus and channel my energy.
We're fortunate if you wrestled, because if you wrestled, natural talent helps, but it's 5% of the ingredient. It pales in comparison to heart and technique and effort.
It humbled me, taught me humility. Nothing can humble you more than wrestling. I think it's the learning to adapt, right? You learn how to adapt, you learn how to solve problems.
If I look back at my time I spent wrestling, if it gave me one thing more than anything else, it's mental toughness.
Yes, indeed. We've done it. We're back. Another episode is here. Rejoice, ladies and gents. It's Wrestling Changed My Life. My guest today is Mark Branch. Mark is one of the few four-time NCAA finalists in wrestling history. He won it as a freshman, and even crazier is that he entered the national tournament with an 8-9 record and still won the nationals. It's one of the great stories of all time. He also won it as a senior. He was a member of that 1994 Oklahoma State Cowboys team that won the nationals and beat Iowa. This is a great conversation. Unfortunately, we only focus on Mark Branch, the wrestler, because we didn't have enough time to get into his coaching credentials. But obviously, he's the head coach of Wyoming. He was an assistant at Oklahoma State for many years, so we don't talk about that now, but we will in the future. Fan of the week goes to the Mansueto twins, Phil and Rocco. Probably the most Italian name I've ever heard in my life. Rocco Mansueto. I love it. I even love it more that the fact you guys listen. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Last but not least, folks, I'm doing a listener appreciation event, happy hour, this Friday in Iowa City from 5 to 7 p.m. at the Airliner. So if you're going to the Iowa-Penn State duel, stop on by the happy hour, have a few Bud Liates beforehand, get yourself ready, then we'll head over to Carver together. 5 to 7 p.m. this Friday at the Airliner, listener appreciation happy hour. And that's it, folks. Let's give it up for Mark Branch. Peace!
My brother started wrestling, so I had a brother that was 3 years older than me, and he started wrestling, I think, when he was about 6. So I was 3. And he really got kind of involved because both of my mothers wrestled for Broken Arrow High School there in Oklahoma, which obviously has a storied program, but they wrestled there. And so they got my older brother kind of started. And, then I instantly became the practice dummy. After he would come home, he would show the moves that he would learn on me on the living room carpet. So that's kind of how I got going. And then when I was 5, at the time that was, you had to be 5 to join the takedown program there in Newkirk. So I started right away and really just picked it up and loved it instantly. And I was pretty scrappy, I was already used to fighting off my brother's attacks, which we were kind of, we were at that age where I was annoying to him. And yet I was always tall for my age. Mm-hmm. And he was just kind of probably regular size. So I was from a height standpoint, I was almost, I was close enough that I could look him eye to eye when he was punching me. So, I started wrestling, we fought all the time. And so I was pretty scrappy from a young age and did pretty well right away, but we wrestled, my hometown was probably about 1,200 to 1,500 people.
Mm-hmm.
And, we just wrestled in these little YMCA tournaments that were, within, a stone's throw away from Newkirk, so we'd hit Ponca City and Blackwell and Perry and Morrison and, Ark City, Kansas, which has a great wrestling tradition. But we just kind of wrestle in those little league tournaments and those YMCA tournaments. And that was cool. And that was what we did.
Yeah.
So wrestling was just kind of like a fun thing for me to do when I was a kid. And I was active. I mean, super active. I was very hyper. I remember my aunts and uncles and grandparents and stuff would always tell me just to sit down because they didn't know what I looked like. They're like, we never can tell what you look like because you move so fast and you're running all the time. So it was like, just sit down for a minute. We want to see what you look like. So, wrestling fit me perfectly in that sense.
Were you always competitive all the way through?
Yeah, I was. And it was strange because I was always awkward, for the sport. And I think it's become more diversified, but it seemed like when I was coming through and even through college, there weren't a lot of guys built like me. And so, as a young kid, I was gangly. My knees were way bigger than my legs, so I had these knobby knees and I think kids would kind of look at me and laugh and be like, well, this is going to be an easy win. And like I said, I was pretty scrappy and unorthodox. And I grew up, I think some things that helped, like when I was young, I learned we lived by a lake and we would go, we pretty much every weekend in the summer, we were living at the lake.
Mm-hmm.
And me and my brother loved to water ski and stuff. And so, I mean, I would literally I would water ski until the boat ran out of gas. And to be honest, I didn't think about it then, but looking back, I always had a really strong grip. And I think it was because I would spend my summers holding on to the ski rope, just all day long, And so, I could grab kids and control them and wrap my arms around them. And they, I was pretty, so in that sense, I really, I had a style as a young kid that was competitive because nobody really knew what to do with it.
Right. And I've heard you say, and for the folks who are listening who don't know, Coach, how tall are you?
6'2".
6'2".
I've been as tall as 6'5", according to some people.
So that's what we're referencing when we talk about that, because far and away one of the tallest NCAA champions maybe ever. I mean, I don't know if we can validate that, but did you get
at 167 probably. Yeah. I mean, I remember, our assistant coach at Oklahoma State, Mark Perry, was really adamant about me becoming a heavyweight because of my height. And he was like, we got to get, you got to get lifting, you got to get on a program, we got to get some supplements, and we got to bulk you up. And I'm like, I never filled out, and so people ask me too all the time now, like, how did you ever make weight? And I'm like, it really wasn't ever a struggle. I was actually one of the lighter 167 pounders because that was before the rule changes went into effect with weight cutting.
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly, my natural weight was around probably 175, and guys were cutting in well into the 80s
mm-hmm.
to get down to 67. So I was one of the lighter ones, but definitely, I had a height advantage on every single person. I never wrestled anybody in college taller than me, that's for sure. So,
Never.
But I laugh because it would always, in college, whether it was Win Magazine or Amateur Wrestling News, those were like the two only media outlets back then. But if there was ever an article that either referenced me or I had a couple articles that they did about me, it seemed like in the articles I was always 6'5", and I'm like, where did they get that? I never said that to anybody, so I don't know if it was just a guess, but yeah. So I've been as tall as 6'5", but I'm currently back down to 6'2", where I've been since a sophomore in high school. So
one of the times you mentioned you didn't have trouble cutting weight, I read a story about the one time you did have trouble making weight your sophomore year in high school. You were undefeated that year. Is that fair to say?
Yep.
And then You get to regionals and you miss weight. What happened?
That was, again, they didn't have any weight allowance. You didn't get an extra 2 pounds after Christmas. And I was 6'1", probably 6'2", and I started the year at 130 pounds. Now my freshman year, I was 6 foot at least. And I was wrestling 108 to start with. And that was killing me too. I mean, I didn't have any, I had no fat. And so I was struggling with that. And about mid-season, I ended up going up to 115, finishing that year. My sophomore year, I started at 130. And by mid-season, I'm still growing. And I'm just, I literally I always feel bad because I'm like, okay, it was on me and I missed weight. And I had done it one other time in a duel, maybe, I don't know, maybe a month earlier, I had missed weight at a duel. And it bothered me. I mean, I felt like I let the team down. I let my coaches down. It wasn't like, but at the same time, I go, it wasn't because I wasn't disciplined. Mm-hmm. It wasn't because I was the guy that was sneaking, cookies and Doritos and pop and doing that stuff. I mean, I literally just, I had no body fat on me. I was just too big for the weight. And so we get to the regional tournament, and I ended up throwing, which I was, if I remember correctly, I threw a trash bag on, and I was up at the top of the gym trying to run it off, and I couldn't even get I couldn't sweat even with a trash bag. And you couldn't wear plastics or a trash bag in high school back then. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I just remember just being crushed and missed weight, and it sucked. I was definitely, probably the best guy on the team as a sophomore. If not, maybe at least one of the better guys. And here I was, like, poised to. My big goal that year was to try to knock off Jerry Best, who at the time Jerry Best was going for his 4th state title, and he was undefeated in high school. He was one of the few guys that went completely undefeated in high school. So that was, you always have something at that age. I was a huge Rocky fan. I watched Rocky with my son last week. We were watching, of course, we've seen it many times, but he was laughing about. We actually watched the marathon. So we started on 2 and went all the way to 5. Unfortunately, we should have stopped at 4, but I had to tell him why 5 was so bad. I was telling him like 5 was such a letdown, and he was like, why? And I'm like, okay, well, just watch it and you can see for yourself. But he was laughing about how they taped the picture up on the mirror, and he was laughing at it. I'm like, I remember taping articles up in my house, in my bedroom and stuff. And that was like that motivational stuff. And I was going to knock off Jerry Best. And then I go to regional tournament. We were in 2 different regions, but I go to the regional tournament and don't even make weight. So now I'm not even in the same weight. I was just devastated. And I remember like thinking that my season was over. And we had a kid on our team named Alan Perkins, who was our 136 pounder. And he basically went up and told our coach, said, hey, I'm not as good, and I'm not going to qualify for state. He needs to take my spot.
Wow.
And so, literally gave me, because I wouldn't ever ask for it or anything, but I had guilt on that for a long time. And I felt guilty because I took his opportunity even to wrestle. And you know what, to be honest, if he would have qualified for state, that probably would have been a huge thing. And I had these aspirations of being a state champion that year. So I go up to 136. I end up qualifying for state. I got beat at regionals. I hadn't wrestled any of those guys.
Wow.
I get beat at regionals. I go to the state tournament, and I don't even place. I don't remember if I went 2-2, 1-2, but I go to state. I don't place, and I literally leave the state tournament. Hated wrestling. Swore that I wasn't going to wrestle anymore. Told my parents I was done. I was quitting. And pretty much for the next several months, that was my mindset, that I never wanted to wrestle again. And a lot of it was the guilt. I'm like, all for nothing. Like I ruined this kid's season. and it was for nothing. I didn't even walk away with a medal, so I hated it, and I hated the sport of wrestling there for those several months. And when, after summer came around and probably into football season, I'm like, what am I going to do when football's over? And I literally hit, and I don't remember the conversations, but I know in my mind, I just said, I'm going to wrestle. I'm never cutting weight again. I'm going to wrestle whatever I weigh. And I'm sure it was somebody, whether it was my dad or my mom or uncles or maybe even my coaches that just said, hey, maybe they knew, that I wasn't going to wrestle again. And they said, just don't cut weight. I don't remember, but I just know that was the deal. I was like, I'm not cutting weight anymore. I'm going to wrestle whatever I weigh. Mm-hmm. And from that moment on, not only did I go undefeated the rest of my high school career, I didn't even give up a takedown. For 2 years, I didn't get taken down, and most of my wins were falls. And I literally, gosh, of course, who wouldn't love that?
Yeah.
Those are, we talk about like wrestling's, there's so many things that aren't fun about wrestling. And one of the few things that's really fun about wrestling is winning. And so I was not only winning, I was dominating and won 2 state titles. And man, I tell you what, I loved wrestling, but in my mind, I'm like, and ever since then, I'm like, there's times to be disciplined, but if your body's hurting, if you hate wrestling because you're cutting weight, then you got to make that, you got to make that change, because it almost ruined me for sure.
Man, and to think that you never almost wrestled against crazy, but you're not the first one to say that. A lot of people I've had on here have said after a heartbreaking moment, they almost didn't go back out. Anthony Robles is one that comes to mind after his junior year. But I want to go back to the tournament your sophomore year, because you were still undefeated all year. You would think going up one weight class wouldn't be that detrimental. How much of it was the fact that you were just kind of out of it mentally and feeling guilty versus wrestling, just that the guys were bigger and beat you?
I think a lot of it. I learned so much later on, the mental game of wrestling, and there's nobody that will convince me ever how big the mental game is in this sport. And the fact that I probably hated myself from that moment on. I couldn't shed the guilt. I couldn't focus on anything but that. And I look at those moments as teaching moments. And I always say this, I go back to this because I was the first freshman from my high school that ever qualified for state. And I remember it, like, I remember from the mental standpoint, when I qualified for state, and that was what people were saying, like, you're the first freshman to ever do it. My season was done. And the fact that I was so happy and content to be the first state qualifier. Mm-hmm. So I went to state just for fun, just like, my season's over. This is just to enjoy. I didn't care. And I didn't want anything more. And it's the transition from that moment to my freshman year in college was monumental. And to the mindset to change, to go, I'm sure we'll talk about my college career, but yeah, that transition was 100% mental. So there's no doubt to me that shame and that guilt and that disappointment played into everything. Yeah. I was broken. So, but yeah, it was all those things are great experiences for what developed, after that, and what made me successful as a collegiate wrestler.
Yeah, no question. In your freshman year, we will get to it, but before we get to the nationals your freshman year, I want to talk about 2 stories that I've read about. One is your first match on varsity at Oklahoma State. Let's not forget that the 94 Oklahoma State team is one of the great teams of that time. National champs. They beat Iowa when Iowa was going for 4 in a row. So you're coming on a team with Freed, Perler, Pat Smith, some great dominant wrestlers. Your first match out, you draw the kid from Missouri, Shannon Fry, and you lose that match, but you take him to overtime. And then everyone's congratulating you that you lost in overtime. And then the next day, the newspaper comes out, and word is you still have this newspaper clipping. I'm not sure if you do. But unlike your freshman year where you were like, yeah, I'm the first qualifier, great. Your freshman year of college, you were so pissed you lost in overtime, and you were just kind of annoyed that everyone was congratulating you. I just thought that was an interesting transition. Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, this was in mid-December. It took me several months to get into the starting lineup. I mean, I tell this story all the time. I'm like, I started out third string. We had two, George Parker and Willie Thompson were a senior and a sophomore that were ahead of me. They beat me, number one, they beat me in ranking matches, both of them. Then we go to an open tournament, and they both place, and I don't. I get beat out. I don't think I wrestled them head to head. And then we go up to Lock Haven Open, and we all three wrestle on that. And they both beat me in that. And this was in November. So they one of them beats me on the championship side, and one of them beats me on the consolation side and beats me out of the tournament. So, I always tell my teams this, because I'm like, I see it so often. Like, if things don't go right at the first week, some guys throw in the towel and they're just like, okay, my season's over. And that's their mentality. And I'm like, not only did I lose the ranking matches, but then it was verified, and then it was triple stamped. It was like, everything was against me. And I go, why do you think I ended up getting another opportunity to get back in lineup? And it's funny that a lot of people can't even, I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. Somebody get hurt. And I'm like, it's because I didn't quit. I didn't give up. I kept coming in and training. And his coaches saw something in me in practice and the thing is, I could beat those guys in practice. But I just couldn't figure out how to beat him in competition when it mattered. And especially, I would say, George Parker, he was very savvy. He was actually kind of like a 6-year senior. He was good. I mean, there's no doubt everybody that knew him, he would have All-American that year. And so he was a veteran. And I was, actually one of my teammates who was his buddies came up and told me at some point that year, said, "Hey, have you ever wondered why George asked to work out with you all the time?" And I'm like, "No, I mean, I'm dumb." I'm like, "Huh? What do you mean?" Because we're around the same weight. And we're good training partners. He's like, "No, he wants to keep it. He wants to always have the upper hand on you. He's figuring you out every chance he can." And so I would beat these guys in practice, and then when it was time to compete, I couldn't do it. So I go, but I got another chance because I didn't quit. And something they saw, they were like, I think this guy's the better guy. He does it in practice. We just got to figure out how to get him to do it in competition.
Was there uproar amongst the team, though? I mean, you had been beaten by these guys a bunch. Like, were people questioning why, or was just they knew your work ethic?
Not that I know. Yeah. I never caught wind of that. I mean, you never know. There's strong relationships. Maybe some people didn't think it was right. But I had to earn it too at the same time. It wasn't like they just threw me in the lineup. I had to, I got another chance to have a wrestle off, and I won. Okay. So I got in the lineup against Missouri, and I'm wrestling the returning NCAA runner-up, Sean Fry from Missouri, who's ranked number 1 at the time, I think undefeated at the time. And that was my first varsity match. And like you said, I lose in overtime. And not only right after the duel, fans, all of a sudden fans who didn't even know who I was the day before are like, "Oh, that was so awesome, man. That was so great. You're going to be a good, now they're predicting my future. You're going to be really good," and all this. I'm like, I was mad. I was like, it's kind of like, I doubt I put on a fake smile, but it's like, am I supposed to smile and say thanks? Mm-hmm. It was a sour taste in my mouth. And then you're absolutely right. I still do have the article laminated from my roommate, Shane Czar. He laminates the article, and on the back page, he writes a letter to me in Sharpie. And he writes it to me and says, I always knew you could do this. I don't remember word for word, but it was like, "I'm so proud of you." And the article, the crazy thing is the article was about me. We smashed Missouri. That was back when Missouri wasn't very good. He was like their best guy. We smashed Missouri, and the article was about my loss and how I really came out, and that was my coming out party. I'm like, I got beat. Yeah. I just wanted to scream it to the world, like, I got beat. And so he wrote this nice, encouraging letter. about how, I knew you could do it, and you were, I always believed in you, and I love it. I love it. And a matter of fact, like, this is awesome because right behind me, so these two framed poster articles, and that's from the NCAAs. That's our scheduled poster that year. So that was the same guy, my roommate Shane. He got those after the '94 Nationals. He got those framed really nice. Of course, none of us had money then, but must have cost him everything he had. But he got those framed and kept them for years in his office after we graduated several years ago. Before I moved to Wyoming, he said, I stopped by his office and he had them off the wall and he handed them to me. And I'm like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I always got these for you. I just knew you wouldn't appreciate them." Wow. Really special, cool deals. But that article, yeah, you're right. I was just like, I was disgusted. And at the same time, it's like, it was clicking in my head that I knew that I was different. I knew that I'm like, this is, the fact that I'm not buying into all this is a good thing, and I should never buy into it. And I think that had a lot to do with Coach Smith and just his mentality. I mean, back then he wasn't really soft and cuddly. He didn't give out a whole lot of hugs. I mean, it was reality, I mean, if you won and you didn't win the right way, I mean, you were going to get, you didn't get a whole lot of attaboys. I'll say that.
Yeah.
And so, it did change my perspective of being a competitor, and it hardened me. And those are the things that I did need, to have success at that level, because I guarantee you, I wasn't going to have success because of my athleticism, because of my strength, because of my speed, because of my technique. Those weren't the reasons I was going to have success.
Yeah.
I was going to have to outwork my opponents, and I was just going to have to be mentally tough, and those are the things that were happening within me that I recognized at that point.
And I've heard you say your work ethic gave you the confidence just because you knew you were putting in the time. But it sounds like to me, from high school when you were with Gene Bennett to college when you lost that first match, the mindset had already changed a little bit, right? The expectations had changed a lot. So I guess who was instrumental in that? Was it Coach Perry? Was it Coach Smith? And do you remember any one moment where it changed during your redshirt year? Or was this a slow progression of the new expectations of Okie State?
Yeah, I don't know that I recognized it changed until like that moment. Mm-hmm. And then that's what I'm saying. It clicked. And I was like, the fact that I'm not like these people telling me good job is making me mad is when I was like, I knew that I was like hungry. I knew that I was wanting more. I knew I wasn't satisfied with just being a starter. And I see that still, like some people, and I told some people, I'm like, I remember, like, I thought it would be so cool if I could just get a letter jacket at Oklahoma State. But at that moment, I didn't want that anymore. Right. Yeah. I was like, I want more. I don't want to just be in the starting lineup. I was embarrassed. I lost and I was mad. And it was a good thing to be on such a good team, because I consistently that year, I felt like I kept letting everybody down. Like, they're so good and they're so talented. And here I am. It's like, we keep, here I keep losing and they're all celebrating in the locker room. And I'm sitting over there in the corner, with tears in my eyes. I mean, those things really, I think, went a long ways to hardening me, and you talked about Gene Bennett and Coach Bennett was not I don't know that he was the most technical coach in the world, but he was a strong man of faith and moral character. But he was a Marine in that wrestling room, and we were old school. We had a tiny little wrestling room the heater was half the size of the wrestling room, right? The heater was so huge and the room was so small, and he cranked that thing up there, and it was like torture devices. I mean, you were suffering for air and you were trying to figure out. I mean, we literally would have this corner that you could get your mouth, like you take turns, but there was a corner between the mat and the wall mat in this old rickety building that you could get a little cold air, and you just stick your lips in there, and you're like, if this is, I have to have this to survive. So the one thing I knew going to Oklahoma State was, I'm like, I know I can get through anything physically. Like, there's nothing physically that I will encounter here that I can't survive.
Yeah.
Now, the things that were the hardest to survive was just the level of competition, getting my butt kicked every day.
Yeah.
Taking a butt kicking every day was hard mentally. But the physical work, like, I knew I could do it, and so that was that work ethic that was instilled in me. And then Coach Perry was, I think Coach Perry was like, he was probably more personal on a technical level. Like, I think Coach Smith was like, great, like I said, with the mentality you have to be successful. And I think he probably looked at me like, what am I supposed to do with this guy? This guy's 6'2", 170 pounds. What am I supposed to do? And I think Perry was pretty like creative. He really helped me, which my uncle Bill, which was my mom's brother, really helped me get started with leg riding, and really encouraged me to do that. My brother was pretty good with legs too, and he was mean and nasty. I mean, he was mean. He wasn't that great of a wrestler. He would just beat you up. I mean, it was like a street fight, and so he was really successful just being a hard ass and making you suffer, right? He was just so, like, especially with legs, like I was always trying to look at the legs as a technical thing. Like, how can I use this to my advantage? My brother was like, how can I use this to torture you? Yeah. And so finding kind of that middle ground, and then Perry was like, he saw what I had and really started adding to it so that it was a strategic, more of a strategy. Like, when I got legs in, I had an idea of what, it wasn't a ride. It was like, what can I do now to turn this into, scoring opportunities? And that really helped me from a technical standpoint. So I had so many people that were really helping in molding everything together at that point.
Yeah, I've had Mark Perry Sr. on just because so many people had mentioned how instrumental he was in their careers. And I didn't know he was like Jason Kilber's coach during those early 90s. And so he's kind of behind the scenes with everything, so
yeah, he
seems like just a no nonsense, get it done kind of guy, and that a lot of people say that, including Alan Freed. And while we're on the topic, I got to ask, how dominant was Alan Freed back in those days, man?
He was intimidating, he was just so effortless in everything he did. And of course, Pat Smith, it's amazing, but at the same time, you're on the same team with this guy that's maybe not getting top billing, and yet probably deserved it, because he was just, he was the most dominant guy in the country that year. And it was, I saw one match that against the Nebraska kid that was actually like one of those matches you're like, oh my gosh, he is human. Yeah. Before that, I wouldn't have known. Like, I'm like, this guy's a freak, and so he was so amazing. And the other thing, I remember we were up at, it was either National Duels, because back then National Duels was at Nebraska. No, it wasn't. It was in the Nebraska Duel.
Just a Happy Day story.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, it was such a pivotal thing that happened. You probably know. Most people don't know when they make an impact like that. I'm sure he never thought about it again. But I literally go out. I get beat by Chad Nelson, who ends up being an All-American, good kid. But I knew at that point I should have won that match. Of course, I was now going into matches. Every time I stepped out there, I felt like I was supposed to win, because I was on this magnificent team. We're supposed to win. Mm-hmm. That means me. That's my job. I have to go out and win. And that was part of the problem, is I was trying to figure out how to win instead of learning how to wrestle, and so it was all about win or losing. And so, that was a heartbreaking one. It must have just been a close match, and I knew I should have won it, and maybe I got yelled at. I don't know.
Well, I think what you said in the interview is that your first two matches was Missouri, #1 guy. Then you had Mollica, specimen national champ. Then you had a guy you thought you could beat finally, and you're like, this is my chance to get a freaking win, Yep. And it didn't happen. And I don't know if you were close with Free at that point, but he came up to you afterwards and said some reference to Happy Days, and I don't really.
Yeah, and I wasn't. I mean, I didn't feel super close to anybody on the team, and yet they were supportive. But at the same time, like I said, when they're all having success and I'm not, I felt like I was dragging everybody down. I felt like the weak link. I felt it really weighed on me a lot, and I wanted to change it, and I was sick of it, and so I know that was kind of a low point where I was like, I should have beat that kid. And I'm like, golly, you're right. Like, okay, I had these national champions, these #1 ranked guys right out of the bat. Mm-hmm. And it's like, okay, all right, well, I still got to figure some things out. But then I got to to Chad Nelson, and I'm like, what the heck? Like, golly. And he was good, but at the same time, like I said, I was just like, well, he wasn't a national champion. What's my excuse? I have no excuse. I should have beat him. So yeah, I mean, I literally was in the locker room crying, and Alan walked up to me, and we hadn't had a lot of one-on-one conversations, you know, and he just quietly, he was like, did you ever watch Happy Days growing up? And I'm like, I'm completely confused, which anybody that knows Alan, he's out there, man. He's crazy, but you know, so, and I knew at that time, I'm like, I'm like, golly, he's such a different guy that I was like, I'm from this little podunk town in Oklahoma, this farm, you know, this farm and ranch community, and Alan's like off in Jupiter, right?
Yeah.
So I'm sitting there, and he comes up and asks me that, and I just I can barely raise my head, and I'm like, yeah. And he was like, you remember when Richie missed the winning layup or the winning free throw? I literally grew up watching Happy Days. I knew every episode, and I'm like, yeah. And he's like, and his dad came up to him after the game. I'm like, yeah. And he reaches into his pocket, pulls out a lifesaver, and if I remember correctly, he hands me a lifesaver, and he goes, keep your head up. Here's looking to you, kid. And walks off, gives me a lifesaver. I'm sitting there. I literally just pop it in my mouth. I'm like, maybe this is something that's going to help me. But, you know, I knew everything he was saying in such a weird reference that he was just saying, keep it up. It's okay. You'll get there. Keep working. And you know, he said a million things that you know, I didn't need the words. I knew exactly what he was saying, and it was the right thing at the right moment. You know, it pulled me off the ledge.
Yeah.
Right. Pulled me back and kept me moving in the right direction. So, you know, great memory, but you like I said, sometimes you probably don't know when you have an impact on somebody, over something like whether or not he was just trying to give me a pat on the back and wanted to throw some sort of a tail in there, but
yeah,
you know, who knows what he was thinking, but it made a huge difference in me.
It worked. And I was going to say, before we get to the Big Eights and the Nationals that year, did you ever lose the faith? Like throughout that year, did you ever lose the confidence that you knew you were ready?
No, it's hard because it was a lot of frustration, and I felt unworthy of being on that team. So there were some things there that are hard to, like, well, did I lose the faith? Did I lose confidence? Or I don't know what to say there. I know I was just frustrated, and I felt like a bum, you know. I'm just like was down a lot. And then I'd have a couple of wins, and I had a couple of good wins, you know. And we did go to national duels, and I ended up beating Stan Banks from North Carolina, who, I mean, I know he was a few, maybe even a few-time All-American. I don't remember if he was a returning All-American at that time or if he was just pretty highly ranked. But that, you know, I'd have a win like that I was like, it was a big win for me, and I really helped me. And then, you know, then I turned around that same national duels, and I get beat by Ray Brenzer, you know, and so then it's like, it was such a roller coaster, but, you know, it's like, I couldn't catch any consistency, you know? And so I never started to be like, all right, I'm getting this figured out. I was still just confused.
Yeah.
You know, until later that year. And I don't know exactly, and it may have been Perry and it may have been John. If you ask them both, they'd probably both say it was them. Right. So I don't want to give credit where I can't remember, but somebody did. One of the big deals I was struggling with was I was so tall, and I was having trouble keeping guys from getting to my legs, and my defense was sketchy, and you know, my bottom was a little sketchy. So if I got taken down, you know, I struggled getting up. And so one of the big things that I did make an adjustment, and it wasn't, I don't take credit for it, because I'm pretty sure somebody suggested it to me, was to start wrestling in the lower stands. And so I literally started wrestling down and wrestling down on one knee quite a bit. And it confused guys. Literally, I dropped down to one knee and they'd start backing up, and that was my defense. And once I started like feeling like I could keep guys from taking me down, then my offense started clicking. So everything kind of, there was some things there that I really truly think started happening. And I started getting more confident with my legs, and I was turning guys a little bit more. So there was some progression there that happened. But the funny thing is, it didn't happen. Like, it was trial and error, and I didn't get in the lineup till December. So, this is stuff that, like, I was struggling through January. Like, national duels were in January back then. I'm struggling through national duels, and then finally somebody was like, "You need to do this," and I started doing that, and all of a sudden I started feeling like, hey, that actually works.
Yeah.
And then my confidence started to kind of slowly come up. And so there was like a little bit of, people were like, maybe just like lightning struck overnight. It wasn't necessarily that. There were some things happening there that were building to that point.
When you fast forward to semis of the Big Eights your freshman year, going to the third period, you're up big. And you mentioned that when you had gone down before, that sometimes it was an issue. You're up against this guy from Oklahoma who you ended up wrestling again at the semis and the nationals. You're up big, and you think, I'm gonna hang out here, ride it out, I'm good. You end up getting turned and pinned, and then afterwards your uncle comes up to you and is like, hey, great job. By the time you're a junior or senior, you're gonna be rocking and rolling, and you're just like, you're like, no, it's not gonna be like that. What was that story, and how did that play into the run you had at nationals?
Yeah, you've done your research. You got all the good ones, but yeah, absolutely. That was, I was, again, like, it was like I could have had a V8 moment, like smacking myself in the head going, holy cow, I blew it. And I knew exactly why I blew it, and instantly. Yeah. I knew I blew it. I'm like, I had wrestled such a perfect match, and I had a big lead, and he picked top in the third period, which, it doesn't happen very often. Mm-hmm. And it didn't happen then. So this guy picked top, and I'm like, oh my gosh, he just gave up. He gave me the match. I'm like, yeah, I know what he's thinking. He's desperate, but all I have to do is just hang out, and, I got 2 minutes to just, stay down here and just ball up and whatever. Mm-hmm. And so, like, it was a instant idiot moment. As soon as he turned me and pinned me, I'm like, I'm an idiot. Like, oh my God, I quit. I was like, I gave up. I quit wrestling because I thought I was done. I thought, and everybody always says, don't quit wrestling, wrestle till the whistle, wrestle full 7 minutes. And it's so true, because I literally wrestled for 5 minutes great. And I just thought I had to just survive the last two. And so there was no plan. There was no plan to score any more points. There was no plan to the plan was just go ahead. The match is won. Just, you do your thing down here. And it was a hard lesson to learn. And so instantly I was so mad. Yeah. And yet here I was having a pretty rocky season, and I qualified for NCAAs as a freshman. And so again, I had people celebrating because I wasn't expected to qualify for the NCAAs. And so I had not only fans, but family that were like, oh, we're so proud you're going to NCAA. Wow, what an accomplishment. And that transition from my freshman year in high school, he literally said those words. He was so proud. He came up and hugged me and had tears in his eyes, and he was, just everything. It was just such a moment to even be starting for Oklahoma State. But here I am now going to NCAAs to represent them. And he said, this is what a great deal. He said, this is going to be just like high school. He goes, get some experience. You're going to be able to go to the NCAA tournament, go get some experience. And by the time you're a junior and senior, you're going to be, you're going to be up there. And I just like looked at him and shrugged him off. And I'm like, that was high school. This isn't going to be this way. I'm like, I'm not waiting until then. And literally I went downstairs and put on my sweats, and this was in Iowa State in March. So, nasty snow everywhere weather, and went through on my running shoes and my sweats because the tournament was still going on. And I went and ran. And I don't know where I ran around Ames.
Let's go.
So
man.
Yeah, dude, I told you, man, I'm Rocky IV guy, right?
I love it.
Had opportunity to go train and get ready for the big one. So it was, that again, it was another one of those moments that I look back and go, that was when I knew that I was maturing, and I was, and I give that a lot of, like I said, I give a lot of that no nonsense, like the time is now to to Coach Smith, that mentality to just, he was so confident in everything. And so I think that was a big thing that it rubbed off on me.
When I know you've told this story a lot, I mean, you went into the Nationals as a freshman. You were 8-9, wrestled the number 2 seed right away. You end up winning the dang thing, which is amazing. One of the things I'm most curious in is, how did your mentality change after that when you had pressure the other 3 years? Was that a whole new learning experience to deal with? And if so,
Oh yeah.
Mostly
my sophomore year.
Okay.
Yeah, mostly my sophomore year. It was such a change from, like I said, not starting out third string, getting congratulated for losing, getting congratulated just for qualifying to NCAAs, to you would hear things and you could read things, which thank goodness there wasn't social media back then, because no telling what I would have seen. I mean, I would hear things, and I would hear things like, say, ranking matches. My sophomore year, we had ranking matches, and my brother, I remember my brother telling me a story that, like, he was setting up the stands. Of course, nobody knew he was my brother, and people talking about how I got lucky and I wouldn't win this match, which, by the way, my ranking match my sophomore year was against, John's brother, Mark, and he was, number 1 recruit coming out of high school. And so it wasn't a shoe-in that I was going to, be back in the starting lineup. And I think a lot of Oklahoma State fans, of course, the Smith family, so beloved, and they wanted to see, I believe they wanted to see Mark have an amazing career, and he did have a great career, but I don't necessarily feel like probably the heart of the Oklahoma State fans were necessarily rooting for me in that situation. So instantly I start the year off with this. Now it's pressure to go, everybody thinks it was a fluke, and you'd hear those things, but then also when I'd struggle, and I think I had 6 or 7 losses my sophomore year, that all of a sudden it was like, it became like a big deal. Like, I'm like, shoot, I was losing last year and people were congratulating me. Now I'm losing and they're like, what's he doing? We need to make a change, and he got lucky and he can't do it, So you'd hear those things, and it was, it flipped your world upside down, because it was such a different thing. And you're like, that was just 6 months ago.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
what the heck, man? You're like, in March, everybody was like freaked out. And now in November, I'm having ranking matches, and I got people going, I don't know if our own fans were rooting for me. Of course, I had, I definitely had friends and family and fans that still to this day have been unbelievably amazing and supportive. But I think there was a lot of questions up in the air about what the next few years would bring, And so it was something that I wasn't prepared to deal with. And I think it had to do with some of those losses that sophomore year, is I start questioning myself a little bit, So those are some things that I had to I think work on and work through to get back to that level.
Did you develop any mental techniques or habits that you practiced kind of
Yeah, I
leading up to
did.
matches?
I did. I had a routine of talking to my, I'd go through my pre-match warm-up. I would just tell myself, kind of like those daily affirmations. You're good enough. You're smart enough.
You're better
and
looking than they
doggone it, people like me. No, but I'd go through that list going, you're better. You're in better shape. You train harder than this guy. He can't get to your legs. You can take him down. He can't get out from underneath you. And I slowly started working that way, where I would coach myself up as I was getting ready for my matches. I would tell myself the same thing every time. I would just, and until I finally believed it, because when I started it, I was just like still unsure about some of those things. But I got to that point where I could tell myself that, and I believed it.
Yeah.
And you can't lie to yourself. So you have to, I got to address these problems. If I'm struggling on bottom, I got to figure out how to fix that, because I can't tell myself if I don't really believe it, So that was part of it, is just like getting myself to that point where I believed what I was telling myself.
Yeah. And I've heard you say before, that was backed up, because when you went in those workouts in practice, you'd go all out every single one. And some guys may say that, but obviously with you literally did it, because you were in the NCAA finals 4 times. So you did work hard. I mean, was it just a daily thing for you to go past your comfort zone? Was it just something you did naturally? Because a lot of guys struggle with that.
Yeah. I mean, I know now, I know how competitive I am now. And I'm like, at some point when that developed, I think it was something that I think some of it's just natural, right? Like I was always naturally competitive. I was competitive with my brother. I was competitive playing, I'd ride my bike, we lived out in the country a couple miles. I'd ride all the way into town, through town and across town to play basically, backyard football with my buddies. I loved to compete and try to be the best at everything from a young age.
Yeah.
And so those things those things are hard to shut off. They were even hard to shut off as a coach. Like trying to figure that out once I moved into coaching I was still competitive, right? But I'm trying to train these guys to be the best. And so it's like, at what point do I like pull back the reins to go, I'm going to beat these kids up because that's just like, we're wrestling.
Yeah.
We're wrestling. So I'm not going to take it easy on you. I'm going to, but a little bit, it was like, I still got you. I wanted those guys. I wanted those guys that I was coaching to try to beat me too.
Yeah.
It was a challenge, but I'm like, and I would challenge them to try to be competitive with me. But then at the same time, you start realizing, and I learned this, from other, guys that I was coaching with, and just, people that, okay, I have to put that to the side a little bit sometimes to help develop their confidence. We're getting ready for the Big 12 tournament. We're getting ready for the NCAA tournament. I need these guys to feel like they're wrestling at their all-time best. So I'm going to throw a takedown here and there, right? It was hard to do. It was like, God, I'm freaking competitive. I don't want to do that, The one thing I never could do in practice is I'm never going to let him put me on my back, right? Like, I'm not going to I'm not going to go to my back, I'm not going to get I can't handle that. Now I can concede a takedown here and there, and you're just you're in that position where you're such stronger mentally than these kids are in college, right? And you're still trying to teach them the mental game, but you kind of have it figured out.
Yeah.
To where you're like, okay, I'm gonna actually orchestrate this match all the way down to the last second. It's like, I'm gonna control everything. I'm gonna let them tie it up with 5 seconds left to send it into overtime. And then and so it's a pretty cool thing to be like at that point when you're in your prime and you felt indestructible in those days, but it was hard to always turn off I got to give this up, and so every day in practice, it was, I was that way in practice. Like it was just, it was competition.
Yeah.
So I couldn't just like, I'm going to have a bad day and let me get my ass kicked all day. I just couldn't figure out how to do that. Now it happened naturally for especially my first couple of years. I hated that, I hated it. I couldn't do anything about it. That sucks. I mean, I tell the story, like I feel like it was probably my redshirt year, probably 2-3 months into the season before I ever scored a takedown. And so it's like, golly, that was hard as a competitor. But I never, and that's the other thing. When I was getting my ass kicked for months, I didn't just become immune to it. I didn't say, well, it's just part of the deal. It happens. Mm-hmm. I didn't accept it. So, those things, I think a lot of it was natural, but a lot of it also was that in that environment.
Yeah.
Right. Like I said, where you may go smash a team and then you go to the locker room and Coach Smith's screaming at everybody, and you're like kind of looking around going, we just beat them, 37-3.
Yeah.
What are we getting yelled at? I get like, be mad at the guy that got beat, which was probably me, but it's like, why are you yelling at everybody?
Right.
It was like a perfectionist, right? It was that mentality to become a perfectionist.
I mean, you're hanging around with the best wrestler in the world at that time, where most likely he could have made the team damn likely he could have made the team in 96 and won again. So you're hanging around John Smith, and like, just the atmosphere must have been awesome. And I know, Coach, we got to go, and I realize we're not going to get on any of your coaching stuff today, which is unfortunate. We'll have to chat again, because I know you were the head assistant and the associate head coach during those Okie State dynasty years in the 2000s, and obviously you're building a program at Wyoming now, and you've been there for quite some time and have had some great success. Two things I have to ask you about, though, thinking back to your years as a competitor. The first is, what do you remember with your battles with Marcus Mollica? You guys wrestled a ton.
I remember losing a lot. So solid, never out of position, so strong, athletic. I think we wrestled 7 times. I may be wrong, but I lost the last 6. I won the last one, which is a little bit, I guess, satisfying, although it's like, okay, what do you remember about it? I remember losing a lot. I remember losing close a lot. The only time he beat me,
I thought from what I read, that 95 with the national duels in overtime, when you guys went out of bounds, there was like a reversal. It's like, sounds like you won that one, but
yeah, I mean, there were so many close calls, and he was the second match I wrestled varsity, and he beat me 13-7 or something. And they were all escapes.
Yeah. So
I closed the gap really quick, but I just couldn't figure out how to beat him. And so yeah, there were so many close calls and so many disappointments, and of course, losing to him in the finals my sophomore year was bitter. And I have nothing but respect for him. He was low key, never talked smack. He wasn't, he didn't, he was a great competitor. Yeah. He was just, I hated him because he kept beating me, and so I did beat him my last match. And that was at least a little bit of a monkey off my back. It doesn't haunt me so much anymore, but yeah, I mean, just, what a privilege, privilege to have somebody like that throughout your career that you just is going to keep you sharp and make you keep fighting hard every day in the practice room, try to figure out how to beat him.
I just love those, to your point, those stories of like 2 great champions going at it all the time. And the fact that he was coached by John's brother at the time is like adds a little fuel to the fire. The last thing was, going into your senior year, a lot of people know in the finals of your junior year, you were injured and had the injury default out. And so going into your finals of your senior year, this is your 4th time in the finals, which is extremely rare, but you hadn't won it since your freshman year. You end up beating Brandon, so you won. But what was your headspace going into that match? 'Cause that's just a really unique scenario, kind of going into your last one there.
Yeah, I mean, I felt confident, and it was a tough battle, and I had to dig deep, to beat a very good competitor. But I did feel confident going in there, and of course I'd been in that experience several times, so that helped me. There was a lot of pressure because I went undefeated that year, and so I was like, I've ran the table here, and I have to finish what I started, and there was a lot of emotion there. I'd been battling some personal issues with my mom was going through chemo, and so there was a lot of things there that had been, and I really kind of put pressure on myself to win it for her as well. She was probably my biggest fan, and I felt like I had to do that too. I couldn't let her down. So there was a lot there, but which probably played into me maybe being a little tight, but at the same time, I'm like, geez, Brandon Slay was a great competitor, and he was kind of like Marcus Mollica, very strong, very powerful, never came out of a position, and literally, like, the scoring takedown was not a normal takedown. I couldn't get through his defense with my shots, and it became off of a scramble. It became a counter off of a scramble. And so, it took that but I did have confidence. I felt I didn't probably realize until it was over. And as soon as the match was over, I mean, I just broke down. I broke down like completely, like emotionally, psychologically. I mean, I was like a pile of blubber. And that's when I realized how like much tension I had, how much pressure I had on myself, how much the emotions of what my family was going through had an effect on me. But it was an awesome way. I'm very thankful to be able to end my college career that way, for sure.
Which is crazy that 4 years earlier, your parents were considering not even going to the Nationals, even though you qualified. And then here you are, one of the great college wrestlers of all time. And the last thing I wanted to touch on was, I've heard you say before, Coach Smith is one of the, if not the best college coach in wrestling history. And I know we'll talk about it later if we're fortunate to have you back on when you were coaching with him. But, what makes you say that about him? I've kind of an obvious question, but I really want to know what to you makes you think that he was such a great coach, or what really impacted you from your years wrestling for Coach Smith?
Well, there's a lot. And I mean, being able to literally, I got to Oklahoma State when he was coming back from the Olympics. So, I mean, he was fresh off of being the best in the world, and he pretty much trained every day with the guys. And so the transformation from him being still, I don't know, I don't want to say a kid, but I guess I'm old enough now to go, he was just he was still a kid. He didn't coach. I mean, he was competing at the highest level. And so him trying to figure out that transition from being a competitor to a coach, and just seeing him basically like setting the clock, going, do this, and then he'd jump in and be wrestling. And so you're just kind of like doing your thing and following what he told you to do, to like breaking down technique and really becoming a coach. And even after I was done competing, seeing him continue to develop. And I think that's been probably one of the biggest influences to me as a coach, is like, just like a competitor, like I have to learn something. I have to come in ready to learn every day, and I have to get better every day.
Yeah.
And I've learned how important that is, that like I'm a different coach every single day than I was the day before. And I really feel that way because I'm always evaluating what the changes that I have to make. And so I noticed that, like he made so many changes. I can only imagine in the 11 years since I've been gone, how much he's changed. I still, I talk to guys and I kind of ask those questions, and I get a pretty intense feeling that he has changed a ton in the last 11 years. And I was with him for 11 years. So, to be able to see all those transformations has really inspired me to go, I got to keep learning. I got to keep getting better.
Yeah.
I got to keep adapting, and I'm still competing, right? I'm still a competitor. Like I got to get better every day, and I'm still trying to figure out how to beat him.
Yeah.
So,
totally,
so it's competition, and I think it's definitely, he's had a huge impact on me, and I could never believe, I remember like I think it was my sophomore year, I went to the NWCA All-Star match, and I was the only one from our team that got invited. So he went with me. And here he was, tiny little guy, especially our height difference.
Yeah.
And so that was my workout partner. And that was like one of the few times that I like rolled around with him, because we were just such different sizes, and he kicked the tar out of me. Like I couldn't believe it. Like I remember shooting in on him, and I'm like, it felt like I was shooting in on a guy that weighed 300 pounds. I'm like, oh my God, like those are the strongest hips. Of course, all those, Pat, Mark, all of them, they all had strong hips. But I was like, how do you feel like a concrete building when you're a 135 pounder, or at that time, maybe you weighed 145, probably 95, 90,
okay,
so he's a couple of years.
You're in the thick of it. You've already been in the finals a couple of times, and you're rolling around with them, and it was just, he was that freaking good, that strong. And
yeah. And so that's where I was just like kind of scared. Like, I mean, you talk about having respect from that aspect, to go, how can this guy that I have 30 pounds on kick my butt?
Yeah.
And there's no doubt. I mean, if we were like literally, if we lined up at that point to go a match, I wouldn't have scored a point unless he was cutting me. So, from that aspect, you go, wow, now I know. Like now I realize why he was able to do what he was able to do,
What do you think the biggest change was from like 94, 95 to when you guys were winning in 05, 06?
I think a lot of it had to do with our staff and how we, I think we had a lot of continuity, and everybody was on the same page, and so much buy-in. I always used to say back then, I'm like, we had it. The guys believed in us so much that I felt like if they came into practice and we said, today we're all going to line up on the wall and we're going to stand on our head for 30 minutes, and then we're going to leave. And it's, it's this new technique to get blood to your head and make you, they would go, yes, awesome. So we're going to be better today. They just, they believed in us, and I think we all worked together really well and sometimes that's I've seen some in coaching, different coaching circles where maybe the assistants are maybe trying to undermine the head coach, or the assistants are undermining other assistant coaches, and everybody's trying to get themselves to a higher place. Pat Smith and I were great friends at that time, and gosh, we just really clicked together really well. And I think, we all wanted to win. And so it's like, how can we all do this together? And then if it starts at the top, it trickles down.
Yeah.
And those guys were close, and I think think part of that was because of that, because those guys saw what was happening at the highest level, and they came together, and those teams, those guys are still like amazing friends, you know, and I'm still great friends with those guys. And yet I was their coach, but I was still young enough that like we were on the same page, you know, and we spent a lot of time together. So those were some special moments, and you felt like at some time it would never end, you know? So it's crazy. And then all of a sudden you're like, you know, not too long after that, you're leaving, and that's hard to do too, you know, hard to leave something like that.
Absolutely. So. Well, Coach, it's been an absolute honor to chat with you. The last question we ask everyone is, how did wrestling change your life? That's obviously the name of the podcast. Answer it however you'd like, but I guess what lessons do you take with you even to this day from your days as an athlete?
Yeah, I put out a tweet like last week. I said, I don't know when, but I said, I think, you know, wrestling will become the sport of all sports. I think it's such a, like the world needs wrestling, you know? I mean, it just teaches you so much about discipline and accountability, hard work, sacrifice. I mean, there's so many things that it teaches you that mimic real life. And the longer you live, the more you understand that as you go through tough times and, you know, you go through personal battles, you go, man, this is like you fall back to wrestling, you know, you just fall back to wrestling. And so, you know, that's just, I'm so grateful that I ended up being involved in the sport for as many years as I have. And I know no matter what, coaching or not, I'll always be involved in wrestling. And you know, I kind of felt that at a pretty young age. And I talked about Gene Bennett. He was such a role model for me that I knew in high school I wanted to be a coach. I figured, you know, I'd go back and be his assistant until he retired. So, you know, you never knew what road. I mean, obviously now you're like, well, wrestling changed my life. It's brought me to Wyoming, and, you know, it's opened up all these doors. And, but at the time I knew in high school wrestling was going to be a part of my life. I just, you know, didn't know to what scale. So, but you know, it is, I truly think, and I said, the reason I feel so strongly about that is because of women's wrestling and the growth of women's wrestling, that it's like, now you start to go, this ain't going anywhere. Like this is a sport that, and you look at MMA, you look at what an impact that wrestling has on MMA, and you go, this is a sport that is really pure.
Yeah.
And it's always been that way, but it's pure because it's one-on-one, man versus man, woman versus woman, stepping out there, and it's a battle, and it's been, you know, it's as old as the Bible. And so you go, you know, things are coming around. The world can get wacky, and there's plenty of crazy things happening in the world. But the bottom line is, like, to me, the crazier the world gets, the more I see wrestling as you know, something that we need. And that will be here, you know. And so I just know it has a positive impact on people that do it, and it changes their lives. And for that, I'm grateful that I'm still a part of it, and I get a chance to lead young men every day in this sport.
Well, the great thing to your point is, Coach, because of MMA and women's wrestling, it's only on the upswing from here, baby. It's only on the way up. It's awesome. Coach, thank you so much for your time. It's been an honor to chat with you. Have a good day, sir. And all great things must come to an end. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, give us a review, give us a rating, and share this with your friends. It would mean the world to us. Thanks for listening to Wrestling Changed My Life.